Well, we'll go ahead and begin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lori Krupp. I'm the Donor Engagement Officer with the National Catholic Reporter, and I'm so delighted to welcome you here today. I'm really excited at how many of our readers are so concerned about this topic of human slavery, trafficking, exploitation of the human person. It really is really in keeping with my impression of our NCR readers, that they're so concerned about the world they live in. Sister Marianne and Jennifer, for you to know, last fall I asked a bunch of our NCR Forward members in a poll what topics would they be interested in, and this was one of them that came across very strongly. So you are speaking to an interested and engaged audience in this topic. As many of you may recall, this is part 2 of a session that we are doing on human trafficking. And so our 2 presenters today are working with or associated with U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking. So I would like to begin. We'll get a few announcements out of the way first, how about? And then we'll start with a prayer that Sister Marianne has brought forward. So with the business out of the way, Sister Marianne and Jennifer, are you ready? May I introduce you? Sound good? So Jennifer Reyes is the first executive director of the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking. Jennifer believes strongly in the vision of a world without slavery and exploitation. Prior to this role, Jennifer served as the Assistant Director of the JPIC office for the Sisters of Charity at the Incarnate Word in San Antonio, a congregation she first connected with as a lay missionary in Peru. She holds a Master's of Divinity from Eden Theological Seminary and an Honors BA in Theology and International Studies from St. Louis University. And I will have them call me later. Sister Marianne is a Felician sister of North American Province. Prior to her entrance into her congregation, she worked as a dietitian and research tech in cholesterol metabolism. I always have a problem with that word, metabolism. Later, she worked as a certified diabetes educator and taught science in high school. Sister Marianne now lives in beautiful Enfield, Connecticut, serving as full-time Justice and Peace Coordinator for the Felician Sisters North American Province and edits the Congregation of Justice and Peace newsletter. Sister Marianne serves on the board with the United States Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking and chairs the Education and Resources Working Group. She's the editor of the Stop Trafficking newsletter, which is a great newsletter, and that'll of course be included in our resources. So with that, Sister Marianne, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get to your prayer, and maybe you could share a word about how that came to be.
Okay, thank you, Lori. The opening prayer, the Beatitudes on Human Trafficking, is from the Sisters of Mercy. And I would like to thank Jean Christensen, who wrote the first part of the prayer and is on the board for U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, for sharing it. And so we pray. Blessed are they who have survived, for they will show us courage and hope and dare us to be their voice. Blessed are those who see anew the pain of the world and respond with compassionate action. Blessed are those who never, ever give up on God's promise of fullness of life and freedom from oppression, exploitation, and violence. For they shall be our mercy, our action for justice, and our hope. Blessed are the poor and vulnerable, for they will become co-creators with our God, transforming our torn and fractured world of human trafficking one moment at a time. Blessed are the dispossessed and enslaved, For in time, they will know the depths of freedom and belonging. Blessed are the parents who have lost their children through trafficking, for they will be comforted. Blessed are those who promote the oneness of our universe and understand the intimate relationships of earth, humanity, and the heavenly kingdom. From this understanding, there will be no more trafficking. Blessed are those who with open eyes and open hearts, they are the ones who connect us. Blessed are those who have family and friends who get lured into being trafficked and can do nothing to make the struggle end for them, for they will be mercied. Blessed are the poor who joyfully accept deprivation for the strengthening of faith in God's providence. For theirs is the fulfillment of God's mercy in their midst. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Sister Marianne. As you know, as I mentioned, we held our first anti-trafficking conversation on Tuesday, and that provided a global and national perspective on the issue of human trafficking. Today, we want to look at our families and our communities and how this issue affects us and what we can do about it. So I'm wondering, would you start by telling us a little bit about the U.S. Catholic Sisters Association, the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking?
Yeah, thanks, Lori, and thank you so much for the invitation to share with you all today. U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking is a national faith-based network that works to eradicate modern-day slavery in the form of human trafficking, as well as support survivors of human trafficking. We are a membership-based organization. We were founded by Catholic sisters and today have over 100 congregations who are members of our organization. But we also collaborate and have members who are lay people or who are part of coalitions, who are part of local churches. So you don't have to be a Catholic sister to join and work with U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking. I am not a Catholic sister. As the executive director, to just remind people about that. We need everybody getting involved and working together on this issue. We focus on three main areas in our work as an organization: on action and prevention, on advocacy, and on direct survivor services. And I'm going to let Marianne a little bit about those working groups that we have.
Sure, thank you. As Jennifer said, we have three very active working groups. The education group has created resources, including 2 to 4 page modules on different aspects of human trafficking. For example, on human trafficking and the indigenous population, and human trafficking and children. And another example would be the root causes of human trafficking. And these modules are free and anyone can download them and use them to educate themselves or to pass them on to others. And they are available in both English and Spanish. We also offer prayer resources. We offer webinars for members on different aspects of human trafficking. And we also provide the monthly Stop Trafficking newsletter, which is also available in both English and Spanish. And then the advocacy working group promotes legislation that addresses human trafficking and the root causes of human trafficking. And they are currently promoting advocacy around the Earn It Act. That is a bipartisan legislation and that addresses the exploitation of children on social media. And then finally, the Survivor Services Working Group supports member-run houses for trafficking survivors where they are empowered with life skills to enable them, as Jean Schaefer mentioned on the Tuesday webinar, not only to survive, but to thrive. The group also aids survivors through educational opportunities and they also promote goods made by survivors.
And just to help make the connection between Tuesday's event and today, for those who maybe weren't on Tuesdays, we are the U.S. member of Talitha Cum. So Talitha Cum is the international network of sisters all over the world working to end human trafficking. And here in the U.S., we are the local network.
Thank you for that. I didn't mention that, and I'm really, that's very helpful. Would you give us your thoughts about any indications Pope Francis has made about his concern for this topic?
Yeah, we really are blessed with the leadership of Pope Francis in the church on this particular issue. He has been an incredibly strong advocate to end human trafficking, to support survivors of human trafficking. He offers a really, what I think is powerful image and metaphor for this particular crime. Scourge on the body of Christ. And so I just, would offer that as sort of an keep in mind throughout this conversation, that this is a wound that impacts all of us as one body. So part of our call and our charge to learn about and to address this issue is knowing that even if we feel like we're not directly impacted, because of our connection, as the one body of Christ, we are actually impacted by this wound of human trafficking. Marianne, do you want to add anything?
I just wanted to add that since the very beginning of his papacy, that he created, in partnership with other leaders from other major religions, the Global Freedom Network, which is an organization that seeks to eradicate human trafficking. And that also he spoke about human trafficking in both the encyclical Laudato Si, where he spoke about human trafficking and its relationship with environmental destruction and climate change. And then in the latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, he again speaks about human trafficking. And there's one sentence there that I believe sums up or defines one of the root causes of human trafficking when he states that it's rooted in the idea that a human being is an object, and that objectification or othering of a person made in the image and likeness of God is what allows them to be sold and reduced to being the property of others.
Wow. He certainly has been a pope to stand for human dignity.
Yes.
And against all assaults on it. And I very much appreciate that. To begin the conversation, I mentioned to you that our readers and followers are really interested in this topic. And in fact, one of our followers reached out to me after the topics were announced and mentioned that she is joining a group at their parish. They're just starting a group to advocate and work on this issue. So my question to you sounds super broad, but keeping in mind who we are and that we want to live well in our communities and really work on recognizing and addressing this area. What is it we need to know about human trafficking in our own communities?
Marianne, I'll let you start with that one, and then I'll come in.
There's a lot of answers. Well, first, that it's as I think we said in the advertisement, it's in our zip code, and it is global. And human trafficking is always an exploitation of vulnerability. So you think of the teenage girl or boy who does not feel part of the group, or that they do not fit in. They are very vulnerable. You think, especially today with COVID, of the mother and father who may be unemployed and are desperate to put food on the table, and they are very vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And then the millions of people throughout the world who are displaced because of a civil unrest or an environmental disaster. And think of an earthquake or a flood, when a person needs to flee their home immediately without money, without papers. And again, they are very vulnerable. And the migrants and refugees are populations that are very vulnerable to both sex and labor trafficking. I could go on again, just again with us as consumers, we benefit from child labor and forced labor, from the coffee that we drink in the morning to the food we eat, the clothes we wear. And so I think it's important to be an informed consumer. And one simple way we can learn about how we benefit from child labor or forced labor is by taking the Slavery Footprint Quiz, which is online. And I believe the link is going to be included in the resource page that Laurie mentioned. With the quiz, you answer questions about your lifestyle and your spending habits, and hundreds of products were studied, and it was determined how slaves were used to produce each item. And then, so at the end of the quiz, you can see the possible number of slaves that were required in order for you to maintain your current lifestyle. And then Jennifer, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think one of the important things for us to know about the current reality of human trafficking is the history of human trafficking. To understand that human trafficking, even though thankfully it is talked about more, I think more people are becoming aware of it and addressing this issue, it's not a new phenomenon. And it's not something that exists in a bubble by itself. It's deeply entrenched in and connected to a long history of systemic oppression and systemic injustice. So I sort of trace it back, at least here in the United States, to the history and slavery, right? As Marianne mentioned, and Pope Francis has talked about, it's really rooted in the objectification of a human being and treating them like an object that can be used either for sexual exploitation or for forced labor exploitation. And this is the history of colonization and slavery in our country, going all the way back to the 1500s. And I think it's important for people to understand how we've inherited generations of these systems and laws that are in place that do disenfranchise certain populations in our country that continue to be disproportionately impacted by human trafficking. And so when we think about human trafficking and how are we going to address it as, regular, ordinary citizens, it's deeply connected to the ways that we're addressing racism in our country, that we're addressing sexism and patriarchy, that we're addressing climate change, recognizing how climate disasters and climate change is forcing certain populations to relocate, making them vulnerable to trafficking. And looking at the economic systems that drive our country that are continuing to increase this gap between the ultra wealthy and the very poor, knowing that poverty is a major factor that contributes to human trafficking. So just understanding that all of these issues are connected and rooted in this really long history in our country that is going to take all of us doing the work together to really root up and transform.
Sister Marianne talked about vulnerable, that the vulnerable among our community are the most susceptible. And you just brought up poverty. And we know there's an enormous amount of children living in poverty, which makes them vulnerable. What are other ways that children are vulnerable to human trafficking?
Yeah, unfortunately, one of the things that we've been hearing from colleagues in this field of anti-trafficking during the pandemic in particular is that the rates of online exploitation of children have increased during the pandemic, which unfortunately sort of logistically makes sense for a lot of reasons, that as people have been stuck at home, the rates of online exploitation have increased. And so children, while also how they've gone to online virtual learning or are spending more time on their phones, on these different social media apps or playing video games, are really sitting targets for traffickers to reach out to try and establish a relationship with and build up some level of trust for them to start sharing more sexually explicit content or even potentially meet up with this person in real life. So it's important to understand how children using technology today can be really vulnerable to traffickers reaching out to them. We do have some resources on our website. That we have a whole page of, how kids safe online. There are video tutorials and also like PDF handouts that are both for adults and for children to help educate your children, the children in your life as well, about how to stay safe when using these online devices. And as Sister Marianne mentioned in the beginning, we have an active advocacy campaign going right now to support a piece of legislation that would help to prevent online child exploitation and also hold accountable internet service providers who are allowing this kind of content to be shared on their sites. It's called the Earn It Act. We do have a new Congress now, but we're very hopeful that it's going to be reintroduced in the 117th Congress. So do kind of stay tuned and connected for that. We'll let people know once that gets reintroduced.
And perhaps that's another thing we can provide in the resources, information about the Earn It Act.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Sister Marianne, how about you? Did you have any comments about children? How are children vulnerable?
Well, again, just what Jennifer mentioned on social media. I just wanted to, I guess, offer another example, and that is children in the foster care system who are very vulnerable. And a large percent of child sex trafficking victims have been in the foster care system or are in the foster care system. And then just connected to this, those that age out at the age of 18 or 19, 20, 21, depending on where you live, have very few skills to navigate the adult world. And they come out of the system and they're homeless. They have no place to stay. And there are many that on the first day they age out of the foster care system end up as a trafficking victim. So I just wanted to offer that up as one example of children being vulnerable. I just wanted to add, though, to what Jennifer said, that I think children need to be taught to look out for their peers and look out for their friends. And sometimes children will tell their friends something that they would never tell an adult. And if you hear something, children need to know that if they hear something or know something about their friend, that they really need to take responsibility and report it to a responsible adult, just as a way of protecting their friends. And then I guess the other thing would be that for parents to ensure or to check with the school administrators and to be sure that human trafficking is included in the curricula. and there are many age-appropriate resources out there. And we offer some of these resources we list on our website. But I think that's.
Well, I'm thinking of the email that I received about the parish that's starting a group. It sounds like it could be a good idea for them to include their youth in their parish and do some peer training about.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Do you have resources for those kinds of things on your websites?
I believe our modules could be used for or age appropriate for anyone.
Perfect.
Yeah, we also have links. The other organization I would just recommend on that issue in particular is ECPAT USA, because they specifically focus on child trafficking, and they have youth educators that we have links to some of their resources on our website, and they're a great source of information for youth, sort of teaching other youth about this topic.
In a little bit, I want to turn the conversation over to indicators, vulnerabilities in our communities to child trafficking. But before we do that, the first thing I want to ask you is if you would identify some of the myths or misunderstandings that I might hold that would prevent me from recognizing the indicators that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I can start off with one big one that I think is important as we're focusing on the fact that human trafficking is happening in your city, could potentially be happening in your neighborhood, in your community, is that traffickers don't always look like we think, and trafficking victims don't always look like we think. So, media and Hollywood will present a particular image or scenario around human trafficking where somebody is kidnapped off the street, a total stranger. Based on reports that the National Human Trafficking Hotline has received and agencies with survivors will tell you is that the overwhelming majority of people who are trafficked by somebody that they know and that they trusted. So it's much more unlikely that somebody is snatched off the street and taken by a stranger than the fact that they're actually being trafficked by a family member, potentially a parent or an aunt or an uncle, or being trafficked by a significant other, by somebody that they trusted as a boyfriend or a romantic partner. And so we have to be aware of those dynamics, that the trafficker might not look like we think. They might be a business professional. They could even be a member of our church, who looks like a very well put together family. And so, I think we're going to talk about in a little bit, like some of the signs of trafficking, but just to know, to keep an open mind and to be really vigilant and about when things might seem a little off, to notice, that dynamic.
Right. And as Jennifer said, you could be a trafficking victim and still be living at home. I think another myth could be the way some victims are portrayed, as in like they're maybe portrayed in chains or they're physically abused. And I think traffickers many times use other ways of abusing people or imprisoning their victims that is not physical. For example, threatening them that if they leave, they will kill or harm their family or their loved ones. Or for those who are foreign born, they may threaten deportation. So there are other ways of imprisoning the victim. And then I guess another myth could be that some people may think that this is so overwhelming and such a large problem that what one person does will not make a difference. And every person in some way can help bring an end to human trafficking.
I remember when we were preparing for this session, Sister, you said something that really touched me. You said, if this session could save just one person, you know, we
Yes.
can't be able to save the whole world, but we can save the whole world of one person. We can save one person's whole world. That would be something. I was really captivated during our preparation about the fact that someone could live in their own home and still be a victim of human trafficking. So that was a real eye opener for me. That was one of the myths. So let's shift our attention a little bit to some of the indicators. Um, I'd like to ask you to talk about indicators and warning signs that someone is a victim of human trafficking.
Well, I'll start. So if it's somebody at home, or anybody that you work with, someone you know, any change in behavior, when a person becomes secretive, or if they have new friends and they withdraw from their former friends, and the person may appear controlling. It could be a boyfriend, maybe 1 or 2 years older, maybe a lot older. That they may show up with expensive items that the person couldn't afford, or maybe they are not age appropriate. Jennifer, do you want to continue?
Sure. Yeah, I think the dynamics in relationships, right? If somebody isn't able to speak for themselves, if they don't have control over where they go, where they live, they don't have, in labor trafficking situations, if somebody isn't allowed to keep their own identifying documents, employer is holding, maybe their work visa or their passport, and not allowing them access to that. That type of controlling dynamic in a relationship can be a big red flag that it's a situation of trafficking. It doesn't mean that it always is, but it's certainly something to look out for. Also, encountering somebody who doesn't know where they are. If somebody seems confused where they physically are, what city they're in, what state they're in, that can be a good sign that they didn't get there on their own. Somebody brought them there against their will, and they need some help. And then also too, like Marianne mentioned, just when things seem sort of out of place, if there's a younger girl with a much older man and it doesn't seem like that they're related, what kind of relationship is going on there. With labor trafficking victims, a lot of times, feeling like kind of out of it, or not, not willing to talk to somebody, or not able to because they have somebody else who's kind of watching them, like a manager on site, keeping close tabs. Things like that can all be sort of warning signs to notice maybe something's not quite right in this situation.
I just wanted to add also, if the person is traveling and they're not holding their own documents, that somebody else is holding their documents, or even if a person goes to the emergency room, needs to go to the emergency room, and there's somebody else that's always with that person and they won't let the person be by themselves. And also, if you engage in the and try to engage with the person, that they will not respond and they defer everything to the person that they're with.
Yeah, the travel story reminded me, we had talked about, the power of person being informed and the impact that they can make. There have actually been a couple now of stories reported that because of airlines who've trained their employees about some of these red flags and what to look out for people who are on these flights, that they've actually successfully identified a couple cases of human trafficking, and were able to alert local authorities in the airport when they arrived, to be able to, separate the victim and their trafficker, arrest the trafficker, get help for the victim. It's important to know in situations like that what exactly to do, and to not personally get involved, because that could put the victim more at risk, so it's knowing who to report it to and the proper authorities who can follow up from there. But just that power of knowing what are some of those signs, and being able to potentially, identify and rescue a victim in a situation like that.
What about some indicators in the community itself? Like, are there certain places in our community or certain events or times in our community when we might see an increase of human trafficking?
Yeah, so traffickers follow demand, right? And so one of the things to know is that when a large gathering, honestly, almost of any kind, really see it around large sporting events, but any kind of large convention or large gathering where there's going to be an influx into your city from out of state, there's an increased demand, and traffickers know that and will go to those large events. So being aware if your city is a large sporting event. I think I just saw something come through in the chat about, Tampa Bay hosting the Super Bowl this year. And there's always a task force around the Super Bowl to identify, potential cases of human trafficking and rescue victims. So that's one, but it doesn't have to be the Super Bowl. It can be another large event that just draws in a lot of people. Obviously, we're not seeing that right now during the pandemic with everything kind of shut down and limited attendance, but to be aware of that going forward, that trafficking follows demand. And so what's going on in my community that might possibly increase that demand?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention also after environmental disasters, and we saw that in the United States after Hurricane Katrina, where both sex and labor trafficking were skyrocketed after the hurricane, because these people were vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And, I think we learned a lot from that experience. And I remember when Houston was hit by Hurricane Harvey a few years later, that they, it seemed like they were well prepared. Before the hurricane hit, they had signs up by the red lights, stop lights, stating that when the water recedes, human trafficking will increase. Mm-hmm. And then after the hurricane and the people were in the shelters, there were volunteers who went around to each bed in the shelter and in both English and Spanish left flyers regarding human trafficking, and just to draw people's awareness to it. But again, it's a vulnerable population, and whenever there's vulnerability, and the traffickers will be there. It's always an exploitation of vulnerability.
Yeah, one action we can take in our communities, recognizing that human trafficking is happening, and especially around these events that might draw a larger crowd or these natural disasters that make people more vulnerable, is that if you work in a public place that that people have access to, they're coming in and out of, post information in your place of employment about human trafficking with the human trafficking hotline number, which we'll share, I think, a little bit later. But know sort of like where are places that trafficking victims might have a chance to be alone. So when we were kind of preparing for this session, one of the things we talked about, was like dressing rooms at a clothing store. That might be a place that they actually have a little bit of privacy. So if you have any influence and can get a clothing store to put up some of these human trafficking hotline numbers or signs in dressing rooms, that's a great effort. Also, public restrooms. I think like fast food restaurants or other types of restaurants, gas stations, where the victim might be able to go into the bathroom by themselves. Here in St. Louis, I know if you've ever flown through the St. Louis airport, we've got them up in the airport restroom stalls, you know, the human trafficking hotline and who to call, how to get help. So trying to use your influence that way too, to just put that information out. You never know who might come across that number who needs it.
I'd like to just give a little testimonial about that point, if I could. Years ago, I started an organization called Safe Place for Newborns, where a mother who might otherwise abandon her baby can leave her baby at a hospital, no questions asked. And I wanted to be in the bathrooms, Jennifer, of the bars in college towns.
Mm.
And so we worked with that. At the time, they called it capture advertising, and they let us put our little flyer, just a little bitty flyer. And it just said, all it said was, you know, if you need help with your baby, call this number. And those went up the first weekend of January. That next Monday night, our crisis line got a call from the bathroom stall of a mother who didn't know she was pregnant. And we were able to get 911 to her. And so just that little sign, that little 3x4 sign, you know, so I know you're right. I know that that's a very important thing to do in our communities to get that message out. I know how powerful that can be. You had mentioned airports, so let's talk a little bit about travel. What are some things that we can do while we're traveling? And this was actually a question that came in ahead of time. One of our readers had heard something about an app and wondered about that. And there were a couple other questions people had about traveling. So can you tell us how to stay alert and awake, and what we can do while we're traveling to help fight human trafficking?
Sure. I think the app that they're speaking about is the Trafficking, which is put out by Exchange Initiative. And you take a picture of your hotel room and you send it in, and it, I believe, goes to the FBI. And so when a trafficker will advertise the victim in a hotel room and it's online, then the authorities can can actually find out where they are by matching the pictures that you sent with what they're advertising. So I believe that's the app that they might be referring to. But also, prior to a registering in a hotel, to ask the hotel if they have signed the ECPAT Code of Conduct. It's the Tourism Child Protection Code of Conduct, that stating that the hotel will not condone human trafficking occurring at the hotel, and that they will also educate their staff on what are the signs of human trafficking and then how to report it. And I do want to say that there are hotel chains and motels that are being sued under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act by trafficking survivors, stating that the hotel or motel profited from trafficking occurring at their property. Excuse me. And also there are survivors suing large hotel chains, accusing the hotel of negligence and failing to stop sexual abuse at the hotel because there were signs. There was apparent that there was something going on there. Jennifer, do you have anything to?
No, the only thing I would add is just to stay vigilant when you're traveling. You know, I really support what Marianne was saying. Know the hotels that you're going to and be an advocate to make sure that they're signing on to this pact. And, you know, whether you're traveling by bus or by airline, it's an opportunity where you're going to be, you know, in a space with a lot of other people. And so to just stay observant about, you know, again, the kinds of dynamics you're witnessing. If anything seems off, don't intervene yourself personally, but either call, you know, the human trafficking hotline number, or contact an official in the area or somebody, you know, who works there who might be trained with how to, you know, follow up on that situation. So just being another set of eyes and ears to help stay vigilant can be incredibly helpful.
And I also wanted to mention that many women's religious communities will not hold their assembly or meetings in hotels that have not signed that code of conduct.
Wow. Is that something that we can get and send to the hotel? If, for example, if they haven't signed it, can we encourage the person we're speaking to look into it and send them the information?
Sure. And sometimes people will send letters to the hotel, but I'm not sure how effective that has been.
One question that we've received since we started is that, you know, they're very glad we mentioned support of other alienated groups. LGBTQ homeless teens are very vulnerable, that they often leave their homes or small towns. The question that the person had is, are children told who they can turn to for help, like sisters? As part of some of the education that children receive, or that you can provide parents to give to the children, are they told who to go to for help if something bad is happening to them?
I think it probably depends on, you know, the child. I think one of the things that we can do, that we have a responsibility to do, is to be a trusted adult in the lives of the children that we know, and to let them know, you know, not just in situations of human trafficking, but any type of situation of abuse or exploitation, or that makes them feel uncomfortable, encouraging children to have at least one or two trusted adults that they know they can go and say, hey, this happened, you know, maybe I'm not quite sure about it, or I want to talk about it. It made me feel uncomfortable. And so I would certainly recommend that, you know, as part of this education with children, you know, it has to include knowing that you can go to an adult that you trust and talk to them about this, because so much logical manipulation that happens in the grooming, making the victim feel like they can't talk to anybody about what's happening. So that needs to be an important part of this education.
So let's turn our attention a little bit to where to go from here. What should we do if we suspect, we've looked at some of your indicators and we suspect someone may be a victim of human trafficking? What should we do with that observation?
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and put this one up instead. Share the National Human Trafficking Hotline so that people can either take a quick screenshot. We'll also include this in the resource materials. But one thing we recommend is everybody put this number in your phone. And then you don't have to worry about like, where was it, or how do I look it up, or who do I call? It's just the 1-888-3737-888 is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. You can report any type of suspicious behavior or circumstance that you've witnessed. The more details you can give them, the better in that report, so they can follow up with it. They could also help get you in touch with local, you know, law enforcement in your area, or local task force in your area to do that follow-up. And if you don't feel comfortable calling, there you have a text number as well that you can text, and then they'll, you know, can ask you questions by text to try and get more information to provide help. So the important thing, again, is to not directly insert yourself into that situation for your own safety and the safety of the potential victim of trafficking. But to call, you know, and report it, and to make sure that there is somebody who's trained follow up on that situation.
I like that. Put it right in your phone. And absolutely, we will definitely put this in our follow-up resources.
The other part about this hotline number is that they publish their data. And so you can go in and type in your state, and you can see how many calls were received from your state, and then how many victims were identified. And then they break that down to whether they were sex or labor trafficking or both, and they give you other data. So it's just also a good way to become more aware of human trafficking in your area.
That's great. So I'd just like to ask this for people like me who need to be told things 3 times. So let's say I'm out just minding my own business, having a pizza and maybe a beer with some friends, and I observe, Sister Marianne, a situation you described, like maybe a teenage girl with a gentleman who doesn't appear to be related to her. I think you said things like fearful, doesn't answer questions, but defers to the gentleman. And I strongly suspect that this is what's going on because I've attended this webinar and I'm very concerned. So at that point, I should just pick up my phone and either text or call the human trafficking line and tell them what I'm seeing.
Right. Yes, exactly. It's safe, it's confidential. And as of 2019, there were over 170,000 calls to the hotline, and over 20,000 potential victims were identified. And I think these numbers teach us a lesson. Exactly what you're saying, what you're asking, is that you may be hesitant to call and think, well, what if I'm wrong? However, less than 1 in 10 of those calls led to a potential victim. And so it's better to call and be wrong, and you'll be among the majority of the 150,000 people who did call and were wrong, than not to call. So don't hesitate. And you making that call could potentially turn a victim of human trafficking into a survivor of human trafficking.
Which you just gave me the perfect segue, Sister Marianne. Would you guys talk a little bit about what you're doing to support survivors?
Yeah, so many of the members who are part of U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, various congregations of women have houses and shelters where they support survivors to get the healing services they need, the therapeutic services they need, education, life skills, whatever they need to be able to, live on their own and to really thrive. And so we as an organization try and stay connected to our members who are providing those services and do what we can to help. We have a scholarship fund for survivors that they can apply to pursue their ongoing education. This past year, we gave out 3 scholarships to 3 survivors, 2 of whom are pursuing master's degrees, and one who's, new to this country. She was a foreign citizen who was trafficked here, really just trying to get a basic level education right now to help with employment and the language. And so we were able to help support her. During the pandemic, many of the houses have also faced increased struggles with expenses, with having people at home more, making sure that they're able to provide, the necessary masks and hand sanitizer and all of that stuff, all of us have been thinking about during this time. And so we've done some fundraising to help offset some of their increased expenses during this time. So we always welcome, if people would like to donate, you can donate specifically to our survivor fund, and 100% of those donations go directly to survivors. You can do that through our website on the donate page. Just make sure you indicate survivor services. Another great thing we like to mention is that, there might be people doing work with survivors in your community. And so I strongly encourage you to get connected in and see who's already providing services. what might be ways that you can support those local shelters and houses. Maybe they have needs for clothing or food or, mentorship, or having, people help with lots of different things, related to the various needs of the residents there. So figure out who's already doing this work in your and get involved to help support survivors. And then the third thing I would mention is to really lift up survivors' voices in this dialogue. So we have a whole page of resources on our website of like books that survivors have written, movies and documentaries, YouTube videos of survivors sharing their own story, to really, listen to them and their experiences and share that, and as part of this education and prevention piece.
Thank you. Well, we are at the end of our time, and it's time for us to turn to prayer. I would really like to thank you, Sister Marianne, and you, Jennifer. I know the topic is so huge, and yet in this hour, you've really given us a lot to think about. And I've spent a lot of time with you to prepare. I've looked at your websites and the apps you suggested, and I learned so much today. So thank you very, very much. And a thank you as well to my wonderful colleagues at NCR helping out behind the scenes, sending me little messages to keep us going. So thank you. Jennifer, do you have a prayer for us to close?
I do have a closing prayer, and if I can take just another minute, I was looking over my notes, and the one thing I forgot to mention with survivors is there's a particular case we're following right now of a survivor in Texas. Her name is Trevino. She was 16 years old when she was trafficked, and her trafficker murdered one of the Johns who he was trying to sell her to while he was trafficking her. She's being held as an accomplice in that case, and the DA is trying to potentially charge her as an adult, even though she's clearly a victim of child sex trafficking. So we've been posting about her on our social media. I do want to share just really quick, this information. If you check out our social media channels, I just really want to encourage people to get involved in her case and contacting the DA. She really needs our support to have the charges against her dropped and recognize her as a victim. Unfortunately, this happens to survivors throughout the country, that they are charged for criminal activity that they are either forced to commit or witnessed to while they're being trafficked. And so one important thing we can do as advocates is to stand and help the criminal justice system them as victims and get them the that they need. And this slide will be in the follow-up materials as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Sorry for that little extra, but I didn't want to forget to mention Zeffie's case.
We're happy to hear it.
So let us just take a breath and a moment to close our time here today. God of power and possibility, God of light and love, God of hope and resurrection, God of presence and grace. We entrust our prayers, our lingering questions, our commitments, our longings, and all that remains left unsaid into your heart, the one heart of our collective body. Unite us, empower us, sustain us, invite us to do the work you call us to do in the world. We give you thanks and praise for this day and the possibility of Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Sister Marianne, not only for being with us today, but for doing this important work. You have our admiration and our support, and we're so happy to have some answers to the question, what can I do? And I want